Measuring Behavior by Jason Lee. In this module, we will be going over why we measure behavior, how to measure it, the dimensions of behavior that can be measured, and selecting the right measurement procedure. First, we'll start with a little story. So, Mark has 4 kids, and all of them get home from school at about the same time. And things get a little bit hectic when all the kids come home. All of the kids want his attention, and his youngest child, Sally, will oftentimes cry and scream to get that attention. Mark decides one day that Sally is throwing a few too many tantrums and decides to use an intervention procedure we call differential reinforcement to reinforce Sally's appropriate attention-getting responses while reducing the number of crying and tantrum fits that she has. Now, Mark implements this intervention for an entire month, and he thinks that things are getting a bit better for Sally, but one Friday afternoon, Sally engages in so much screaming and crying that it feels like no progress has been made at all. Mark decides that his intervention is not working and wants to try something completely new. Should Mark scrap his current intervention and try something new? How would he know if it's the right choice to make, and what could Mark have done better? The biggest issue with the previous example is that Mark had no data to help him make decisions. When he began, he just knew that the tantrums were occurring too frequently. He didn't know how frequently or how long they occurred. Additionally, as time went on, he suspected that things were getting better but didn't really know if they were. By not measuring Sally's behavior and then collecting data on that behavior, Mark is in a position where he can't make an informed decision. This is unfortunately a very common mistake to make. Hopefully, by going through this module, you will gain an appreciation for data collection and will be able to avoid making the same mistake as Mark. One last thing that's vital for you to remember is that one data point is not indicative of the overall effectiveness of an intervention. For example, in the previous case that we talked about, Sally engaged in 12 screaming and crying behaviors a day that lasted for more than 3 minutes each. After 1 month, Sally, on average, was engaging in 1 screaming and crying behavior each day, with one lasting about 30 seconds on average. Please make sure that you remember that, because it shows that overall Mark's intervention was successful, even though that one instance of problem behavior was more severe than the other problem behaviors she had been exhibiting. So when we say that we want to measure behavior, we mean that we want to observe the behavior occurring and then record specific quantitative information about that behavior. This is incredibly vital to ABA because it is one of the big things that makes ABA such an effective way of managing and changing behavior. Having numerical representations of behavior means that all of the decisions we make will be based on the data and there's no guesswork or opinion involved. Let's spend a little more time talking about the importance of measurement and why we do it. As illustrated by the story of Mark and Sally, the main reason why we observe behavior and collect data on it is that it leads to a scientific understanding of that behavior. Decisions that are made from fads, intuition, or common sense may seem appealing, but will often miss important necessary components. By collecting data on the behavior we observe, we can avoid making mistakes and focus solely on what will be most beneficial to the people with whom we are working. More specifically, data collection taken before and after interventions lets us know whether or not we should intervene and the overall effects of our intervention. It is important to also take data during our intervention. Behavior is not a static event. Instead, it changes over time. Thus, our interventions may need to be changed or modified to accommodate the changes that we observe. So in other words, if we are not frequently collecting data, then we don't know whether or not our intervention is actually influencing the behavior that we're targeting. Although this is not a comprehensive list, some benefits of data collection include maximizing the effectiveness or efficiency of an intervention, verifying that our treatment is actually influencing our behavior, our target behavior, debunking or exposing junk science, ensuring accountability, and maintaining ethical standards of applied behavior analysis. In this next section, we will cover the dimensions of behavior. What we mean by dimensions of behavior are the distinct features of the behavior that can be measured. There are three fundamental properties of behavior, and that is their repeatability or countability, which means that the behavior can be counted, the temporal extent, and that's the duration of time in which it takes for that behavior to occur, and the temporal locus, which is when exactly that behavior occurs. So let's jump in and explore what measures we can use for each of these. So counting is a very good way of measuring behavior that has a distinct beginning and end, and essentially you're just tallying every instance of behavior. Using a frequency measure usually involves tallying or counting the number of behaviors that occur within a specific time period. When we use rate, we take the observation interval and we take the frequency of behavior that occurred within that observation interval. And what we do is we divide the frequency by that observation interval. So if we have 30 instances of problem behavior in 30 minutes, we can simplify that to one behavior per minute. Some things to consider when you're using a count measure is that the behavior has a clear beginning and end. If there's no clear beginning and end, it's very difficult to get an accurate count of the behavior. If it's happening so fast that you can't actually count it, that also might be a reason why you should avoid using the count measure. If the observations are consistent and equal, that's a good opportunity to use the frequency count. So take a moment and think of some behaviors where a count or frequency measure would be the optimal procedure, would be the optimal data collection procedure. So some behaviors that may really lend themselves to a frequency measure are the number of curse words that are spoken, questions asked without raising hand, burps at the dinner table, or correct math problems on a worksheet. And one more thing with the count measure. When collecting tally marks, always keep track of the amount of time you spent collecting the data. So if you're collecting tally marks for 45 minutes, make sure you write that down with the rest of your data. But why do you think that is? Why should we keep track of measurement time? The simple answer is that measures of count alone do not provide sufficient information for analysis. If one day I spent an entire hour recording tally marks and the next day I spent only a half an hour, then of course we would expect to get different counts simply because we spend more time counting on one day versus the next. Instead, we could convert that into a rate if we know the time that we spent counting. To get a rate, we simply divide our count by the amount of time that we spend counting. This makes it so we can compare numbers across different observation periods. And this is a much more meaningful interpretation of the data we have collected. Since we will usually spend different amounts of time collecting data, a rate of behavior will be one of the most common measures that you will use. So always be sure to record the observation period or time spent collecting data. Refer to this as counting time when comparing across individuals or environments. Lastly, you should consider collecting data on the rate of incorrect or correct responses, and this allows you to see patterns in acquisition or errors related to acquisition. It is important to know that measuring the rate of behavior is not optimal for behavior that occurs over long periods of time. For example, if you're collecting data on behaviors that occur over long periods of time, such as tantrums or crying behavior, you may want to use something like a duration measure. All right, let's practice this. Go ahead and read the examples of count data collected for self-injurious behavior, and then afterward, try to convert that count into a rate before going on to the next slide. Next up are the measures that are based on temporal extent. For our purposes, there is only one behavior measure that we are going to talk about, and that is the duration of behavior, or how long a behavior lasts. A duration measure is best used when our objective is to make behavior shorter or longer. So maybe you want to increase the amount of time that a student spends on task in school without getting distracted. On the other hand, maybe we want to reduce the amount of time that it takes a student to complete a task or worksheet. A duration measure is also good for behaviors that occur very quickly and can't reasonably be individually counted. For example, if the behavior we are targeting for the intervention is lightly biting or chewing on one's arm, it might be technically impossible to count each bite, but a duration measure might make that data collection easier and more accurate. That same idea holds true for behaviors that occur for a longer period of time that may not have a clear beginning or end. There are a couple of methods for measuring duration. The duration per occurrence measure takes all of the data that you've collected on duration for a specific amount of time, say a day or 2 weeks, and then you average the amount of time that the individual spends engaged in that behavior. This gives you a duration per occurrence measure. You can also take the total duration of time that a behavior has occurred and divide that by the observation period. This will give you a percentage of time that the behavior occurred. So if I'm observing crying behavior for an hour and crying behavior happens for 30 minutes out of that hour, I can divide 30 by that 60-minute interval and find that that problem behavior happened about 50% of the time during my observation. One final note on duration measures. If you're measuring the duration of a behavior, you will also get a frequency count for that behavior. So if you're already planning on using the duration measure, it never hurts to analyze the data for frequency as well. So what are some behaviors where duration would be the optimal measurement procedure? A few examples would be the amount of time spent paying attention to the classroom lecture, time spent playing with friends, how long screaming behavior lasts, or how long tantrums last. Once again, behaviors that occur over a potentially long period of time are great for duration measures. The last dimension of behavior that we're going to talk about is temporal locus, or when a behavior occurs. There are two ways that we can measure this dimension. One is through latency, and the second is through inter-response time. Latency is a measure of the amount of time that elapses between a stimulus and the beginning of the target behavior. An easy example would be telling your child to clean the room and then 2 minutes go by before they start cleaning their room. Telling them is the stimulus, or SD, and the 2 minutes would be the latency to the behavior. Usually this data is then converted to an average or even sometimes a range. Usually we think we want to reduce the latency of behavior. If we tell someone to do something, we want them to do it as quickly as possible. But that isn't necessarily always the case. Can you think of any times when we would want somebody to take more time between the stimulus and the onset of behavior? One example is the onset of angry outbursts. If a child wants to play with a tablet device, but for whatever reason the device is currently not available, they may begin to engage in an angry outburst. The latency between being told that the device isn't available and the problem behavior should not be reduced in this situation. If anything, we would want to teach the child to tolerate delays to reinforcement and increase the latency to problem behavior. Alright, let's think of some behaviors where latency would be the optimal measurement procedure. One example might include the time between giving someone an instruction and when they start to comply. So things like the amount of time between telling your child to eat their vegetables and when they actually start eating. Another example might be the time between telling your child to clean up their toys and when they actually start cleaning them up, or even the time that it takes a student to come back inside the school after the recess bell rings. Inter-response time, frequently called IRT, is the amount of time between any two responses. If a student raises their hand in class and 10 minutes go by before they raise their hand again, then the 10 minutes that lapse between each hand raise would be the IRT. This measure may be best for behaviors that don't rely on individual instructions or cues, and that need to happen fluently or at a certain pace. Try to think of some behaviors where we would want to reduce or increase the time between two occurrences of that behavior. What would that behavior look like? One example would be the time between completing math problems on a math worksheet. To be on task and doing math problems, we might expect the time between completing one math problem and starting the next should be very short, maybe a second or two. But of course, some students will get distracted between math problems or simply not want to do anymore. So we could decrease the IRT here. Another example of where we might want to increase the inter-response time is if somebody is eating too fast. So you may want to increase the amount of time that they take between bites. Let's go over a few more ways to measure behavior, starting with derivative measures, percentage and trials to criterion. Generally, you will use a percentage to report the percent of correct responses. Percentage is obtained by taking the number of correct responses and dividing it by the total amount of responses or opportunities to respond correctly. Trials to criterion is used when there is a specific level that we want performance to meet. Getting 9 out of 10 questions correctly on a math worksheet might be a specific criterion that we set. We would then measure how many trials or math worksheets it took to reach that level. This helps us understand how quickly a skill is being acquired. Magnitude is typically described as the intensity of behavior, and this can oftentimes be difficult to measure simply because we don't have the tools to do so. Screaming behavior, for example, could be defined and measured by the amount of decibels that it produces. However, without an accurate decibel meter, it would be very difficult to tell whether one scream was more intense than the other. Another instance of this is a vending machine. So there's a button on the vending machine that you have to press with enough force in order to get that to activate. If you use too little force, the button won't activate. And there may be no way of describing whether you use too much force, other than possibly breaking the button. However, magnitude is still an important variable in that behavior. One way to get at the magnitude of behavior is by using a rating scale. However, these are largely subjective, and you may not get accurate or reliable data from them. Some behaviors cannot or should not occur without an opportunity or cue. In these cases, we want to use a per opportunity measure, but we might want to measure other dimensions as well. If you're observing a behavior that has a limited number of opportunities, you will have to account for that, or your data might become inaccurate. If you have only 3 chances to engage in a given behavior on one day, but on day 2 you have 30 chances to engage in that behavior, then of course we would expect that day 2 would have a much higher occurrence of the behavior simply because there are more opportunities to engage in it. What are some behaviors where per opportunity would be the optimal measurement procedure? 2 examples would be appropriate greetings and hand washing. Generally, you only have 1 chance per person you meet to appropriately greet them. Frequency or rate would be a bad measure for appropriate greetings because a decrease in the rate may only be due to the number of opportunities you have to greet people. Now that we've gone through so many ways to measure behavior, it should be noted that you will often use multiple ways to measure the same behavior. The objective with measuring behavior is to provide as clear a picture as possible. So, in order to accurately capture a certain behavior, you may need to employ multiple techniques. Now we will provide a brief review of each of the measures we have discussed. If you are feeling at all uncomfortable with any of these measures, please review the previous slides. Do you remember at the beginning of this presentation how you were asked to remember a little bit of data for the story of Mark and Sally? It was mentioned pretty quickly, but do you remember what that data was? Unless you wrote it down, it is highly unlikely that you will remember it. This highlights an important part of measuring behavior, specifically that we need to record the data for that measurement as soon as possible. Even waiting a few minutes can alter our memory of that behavior. If we are just making our best guess as to what occurred minutes or even hours after what was actually observed, then our data may be unreliable. If data collection should be done within a few seconds after a behavior occurs, how can we possibly collect accurate data? The short answer is that we need to get creative. We need to find a method for collecting data that works for our environment. The first method we will discuss is called event recording. Event recording is used with the behavioral dimension of repeatability, so that's count or rate or frequency, which we've covered earlier. One of the easiest ways to record events, or in other words, the occurrence of behavior, is just to look for data collection apps on a smart device. These are very popular and usually pretty easy to use. They're also free most of the time. You can also use paper or pencil, where you would just put a tally mark down on the paper for each occurrence of behavior. You could get a clicker or a tally counter and click that every time a behavior occurs, so it increases the count by 1. Some teachers or parents have used tally marks on their arm in order to collect data on observation of behavior, or even put pebbles in one pocket and transferred them from the right pocket to the left pocket in order to count the behavior that they've observed. And, although this might not be ideal, it's better than just relying on your memory. Here's a quick, simple paper and pencil data sheet. Each behavior we are tracking is listed on the left, and each interval is listed across the top. Every time a behavior occurs, we put a single tally mark in the appropriate cell. So between the times of 1 and 1:15, screaming was observed 3 times, hitting was observed once, and crying was observed twice. When no behavior was observed, a 0 was placed in that cell. For example, between 1:15 and 1:30, no screaming behavior was observed, so there's a 0 in that cell. These types of data collection methods are most common for a reason. They are generally pretty easy to do. However, as we discussed during the slides for count and rate, behaviors measured this way must have a discrete beginning and ending. The rate must not be too high, and this is generally not appropriate for behaviors with long durations. We will now watch a brief video so you can practice taking data. If you have not done so already, please print off the data collection sheet that we've provided for you. In this video, you will be using the first section of the data sheet to collect the number of times that this individual engages in self-injurious behavior. Self-injurious behavior is defined as physically hitting the head with an open or closed fist from 6 or more inches away. When you are ready to begin, please press play.
Dude, we're not...
We counted 10 occurrences of self-injurious behavior at a rate of about 5 per minute. Did you get the same? Our next data collection method is called timing. We use these procedures to measure duration, response latency, and inter-response time. We may use computer systems, stopwatches, wall clocks, tape recorders, or your smartphone. Those are all easy ways to measure duration. In this datasheet example, we use start time and end time. But once again, you should adapt this concept to whatever will work best for you in your environment. Of course, you could add as many columns as needed. Let's practice taking data again. Make sure you have your datasheet handy. We will use the same behavioral definition as last time. However, since we're using a duration measure, we will begin counting self-injurious behavior episodes when he begins to hit his head. After 30 seconds of no self-injurious behavior to the head, that's when you will stop your count, or your duration. When you are ready, proceed to the video.
Dude, we're not...
So how did you do with that one? For our duration, we recorded that self-injurious behavior first began at the 19-second mark and continued until the end of the video at 1 minute and 30 seconds. Thus, the duration of 71 seconds. Remember that we only stop the timer if self-injurious behavior does not occur for a full 30 seconds. If you got something different, you're welcome to go back and try to collect that data again. One thing that we'd like to address now is the use of time sampling procedures. This is a little different as it deals more with when the observer makes their observations. To do this, the observation period is divided into intervals, and the presence or absence of behavior is recorded for each interval. That may seem a little confusing now, but let's jump into exactly what we do, and we'll see if we can't clear this up. Just to make things consistent, for the next few slides, let's say that we are just observing self-injurious behavior. The first way we will look at interval recording is called whole interval recording, and usually is used to measure continuous behavior. To do this, we first need to break that total observation up into smaller intervals. For whole interval recording, each interval should be pretty brief. For example, our interval will be 10 seconds in length. This means that there are 6 intervals per minute, 30 intervals per entire 5 minutes. The way that this works is to record data, that is, marking that the behavior occurred, only if the behavior occurs during the entire interval. So if we are observing self-injurious behavior, that self-injurious behavior will have to occur over the entire 10-second interval in order for us to mark that interval. If self-injurious behavior is occurring at the beginning of the interval and then stops 2 seconds before the interval ends, then we would not mark that behavior as occurring because it did not occur for the entire duration of that interval. This is one of the reasons why we usually reserve this recording method for continuous behavior. Also, it is important to note that this method will sometimes underestimate the behavior we are observing. Here is a sample of an interval recording datasheet. A number 1 indicates that behavior occurred throughout the entire interval, and a number 0 means that the behavior did not occur for that whole interval. From this data, we can see that target behavior occurred across the first 10 intervals, or 100 seconds. Then, behavior did not occur for a period of time, and resumed again after that. This is just one example of a datasheet, and yours will most likely look very different, but hopefully you will see how we collect this type of data. When you are using whole interval recording, you will report your data as a percentage of intervals where a behavior occurred. In this example, there were 15 intervals marked as a 1 and 15 with a 0, so the percentage would be 50%. Here is another example. Go ahead and calculate the percentage of intervals where behavior occurred over the whole interval. The answer is 33%. 10 intervals with behavior and 30 intervals total, so 20 without, yielding 33%. Another way to use intervals to our advantage is by using what is called partial interval recording. Once again, our entire duration is divided into intervals, and we are recording if behavior occurs during that interval. The difference between this and whole interval recording is that in partial interval recording, we mark the interval if the behavior occurs at all during that interval. Once again, with self-injurious behavior, if the behavior occurs for 5 seconds, right in the middle of a 10-second interval, we would score the interval with a 1. It doesn't matter if the behavior occurs multiple times in an interval, we really only need to mark it once. Other than that minor difference, the data is reported the exact same way as it is in our whole interval procedure. So what is the main difference between whole interval and partial interval recording? A third way to use interval recording is using momentary time sampling. When using momentary time sampling, you simply only observe at the end of a predetermined interval. If that interval is 10 seconds long, you would be looking at your datasheet for almost the whole entirety of that 10 seconds, and just at the end you'd look up to assess whether that behavior is occurring or not at that moment in time. If the behavior is occurring, you mark that as a yes, or a 1. If the behavior is not occurring, you would not mark it, or you would mark it with a 0. This method is best used for continuous behavior, or when the observer cannot monitor at all times. Think of a teacher lecturing their class. During the whole or partial interval recording procedure, it may place too much demand on the teacher, but periodically checking if a single student is exhibiting a behavior or not might be a lot easier for them. The planned activity check is very similar to momentary time sampling, but instead of recording data for just one student or a single behavior, this is the observer checking to see how many individuals from a group are engaging in that behavior. One example might be on task behavior. If a teacher is collecting data on this, maybe their intervals are set to every 1 minute. And so each minute they look up from whatever they're doing and count the number of students paying attention or doing their assignment. If you are having trouble remembering the differences between these 4 methods, Spend a little time reviewing the previous slides, as well as this one. When using time sampling procedures, remember to use a timing device to signal the end of each observation interval. Also, remember to mark both the occurrence and non-occurrence of behavior. You can use either yeses and nos, or zeros and ones to do this, and that will help you remain on track while you're using this recording method. The last method we will discuss is called permanent product. This method is ideal for behaviors that produce some kind of change in the environment. An example of this is a completed math worksheet. There are a lot of advantages to measuring permanent products, but the main advantage is that it's very easy to do and requires few resources to complete. At times, it can be difficult to select the right data collection method. Fortunately, there is a data collection guide that can help you make the appropriate decision, and we've included that here on Canvas.